Practitioner Committee. I really want to thank David Asher for presenting to us on this important topic that I know for sure. I feel like I had to stumble around and trying to figure out pieces. You try to get advice where you can. You're not always sure there's like a place to get those resources. And David and I actually had the pleasure of meeting back in his medical school days at the Virginia Commonwealth University while I was a resident there. And then he has recently graduated from Miami and getting settled in and welcomed in his new position there in Roanoke, Virginia. So David, thank you so much for speaking to us today. Just a few housekeeping things for folks. If you would please put your microphones on mute. There is a chat feature. And if you have questions, you can save them to the end and ask David, or you can kind of input them in that box and he can have a chance to review them if we have time for questions. So David, please go ahead and get us started.
Thank you so much, Jessica. It's a pleasure to be here. I kind of have been involved a little bit with ACRO and just attending the meetings, being in South Florida. So really benefited from having that close by. So it's a pleasure to finally contribute something to ACRO, because I feel like I've received a lot, and nice to see some familiar names on the participant list, and hopefully get some, this will be recorded, so hopefully people can listen to it in the future. I know it's always hard to get to those daytime lectures, and really appreciate you guys being here. So again, my name is David Asher. I just graduated from University of Miami. Here's some pictures to prove that happened. These are my chair, program director, and some of my awesome co-residents. So it was really a privilege to train there. And a little bit about me, I got married in medical school, and my wife and I are fortunate to have 2 little kids here that are good pals. So got thrown into this, just like many of you, got thrown into personal finance, and wasn't necessarily expecting to lecture on it, but just felt like it was so important and such a responsibility for us with families or not with families, but paying loans back and all this kind of delayed gratification that we get with being in radiation oncology. It's such a great field, but it comes with challenges. So I felt the need to do this. I have no financial disclosures, but I have a disclaimer that I'll get to in a second. So this is what we'll cover today. Again, this is the basics of things. Feel free to send comments in anytime or email me. You can chat. I'm just going through this process too, as kind of a first-year attending, recent graduate. And so in many of these things, I kind of know the basics, but I'm learning as I go. And so it'd be a privilege to kind of exchange information with you all. So we're going to cover basic financial literacy, different insurance types, student loan management, the basics of retirement accounts, a written financial plan, and then finally, briefly on contract evaluation. Now I want full credit to this lecture to go to this physician, who a lot of you guys probably know, Dr. Jim Dolly. He's a full-time emergency room physician in Utah, and he runs a very successful business called the White Coat Investor, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. His books, podcasts, websites, blogs, Reddits, subreddits, what all those things are. So he's my bias is that pretty much all I know is either from him, from his podcast or his books, his website, or indirectly by books and references that he recommended. The other person I'd like to highlight is this man, Dr. Raphael Yachieli, who's attending where I trained at University of Miami. And if you haven't had a chance to meet him, radiation oncology is nice because it's such a small field that I hope you do get to meet him someday, and I'll try to get him at the next ACRO, because he's really just a great person and been very valuable to me in my life as a mentor. So he was kind enough to really get this going in my institution. A couple years ago, he bought this book for all the residents, and also gave out this article, which I highly recommend. The first author on here is Dr. Trevor Royce, who's an early career radiation oncologist himself at University of North Carolina. And it's really well written. It comes at this financial health for medical trainees and early career oncologists from a kind of a different format of this talk, but it's very good. It covers the 4 tenets of personal finance, or financial health, and debt, behavior, investment, and asset protection. That's a very good read and not very long. So I thought that was very well done. So there's a reference for that. It's in Pro from 2019. And the last thing that Dr. Yakiele did for us that I'm trying to pay forward here today is he gave this very nice talk called Financial Basics for Residents. And this talk is publicly available from the White Coat Investor website, and very generous of Dr. Jolly to do such a thing. And these slides are from him. He gives permission to kind of edit them as needed, so that's what we did today. So basically this talk tries to combine some of the financial basics for residents that Dr. Yakiele reviewed with our residency program that I'm trying to spread and have recorded so it's available to others, while also incorporating some of the basics of attending life, focusing on the first year out or the first few years out. And so it's a lot to get through in a short talk, but we're gonna stick to the basics more or less. And then if there's questions, we can get into that. And if we don't have a chance to do it over here, I'd be more than happy to do it via email or over the phone or whatever's easiest for guys, or via Twitter maybe. The only thing that Dr. Daly encourages for the presentations is this disclaimer, which is important. Dr. Daly, the White Coat Investor, and his company, they're not financial advisors, accountants, or attorneys, and neither am I. This is for informational purposes only, and I've edited the slides with some guidance from Dr. Yakiele and inserted some of my own experiences to hopefully make it meaningful for you all. If there's any controversy, any questions, just shout out anytime. All right, so I think this is well known to a lot of people. Physician burnout is a big problem. It's associated with depression and decreased satisfaction with work, which inevitably leads to poor care for our patients. It's very important. About a third of radiation oncology residents report high levels of burnout, and it increases with each year that you're in residency, according to the survey from a couple of years ago that was in the Red Journal. Interestingly, the debt burden also increases with each year, with a lot of people paying a small amount of the student loans. You have the high interest rate that kind of creeps up each year. And then debt burden is definitely associated with burnout. And then about a third of radiation oncology residents report greater than $200,000 in debt, which is pretty typical, and it's a 5-year program, which also allows more time for that interest to accrue. This survey of all different specialties from Medscape, while fairly unscientific, I think captures an important topic. When physicians were asked what would reduce your burnout, the number one thing people said was increased compensation to avoid financial stress. And compensation certainly is an important component. And that aside, I think another component is just preparedness to manage finance as well. This survey from the Red Journal, published in 2014, out of the respondents, 3/4 of radiation oncology residents reported being unprepared to handle future financial decisions. And of the program directors that responded, 80% felt like their residents had poor personal and professional finance preparedness. And this may improve a little bit in the last 6 years, to some credit to the White Coat Investor being so popular. But it's probably not that different. And one of the things associated with residents feeling just subjectively more prepared was having just some modest training, suggesting that there may be a benefit to something even short like this, or just small interventions as we go. And to me, one of the issues is why did you choose to be a doctor? I don't think anyone ever pictures this. And picture something more like this. This nice stock photo, but just patient care seems to be the focus, and it's kind of a little bit of a faux pas to talk about specific salaries or specific compensations, but I think it's really important to kind of break that down, especially in our small niches of each class. We get to know each other very well in radiation oncology. I think it's important to talk about those things. And so if anyone wants to reach out to me independently, I'd be happy to share my experience just going through the interview process this past year about what kind of things I saw then that's paying information forward from residents ahead of me that helped me. So back to what we're going to cover today, starting with financial literacy. The financial literacy, it gets to this is it's a second job. It sounds like a lot of effort. It can be more efficient. I don't personally have a huge hobby in learning about finance necessarily, but I definitely feel like it's a responsibility for me and for my family and for long-term planning, and ultimately to practice the way I hope to practice and to take care of the people the way I want to. I don't want, none of us, we don't want a huge debt burden weighing our decisions in terms of what jobs to take or where to stay or where to live. And it's inevitably going to play a big role. So if we can manage these finances in an efficient and reasonable manner, it'll open up a lot of doors for us, giving us a lot more satisfaction. And none of these things, unfortunately, are automated, but they can be pretty simple at the end of the day to do it, to manage your finances effectively and efficiently. And so I'm sure a lot of us have friends from college that went into finance, and they've been working as hard or sometimes maybe harder, I don't know if that's possible, to learn that game. And if we don't learn the basic rules, then it's not something we can manage effectively. And you have to spend time taking care of some of these basic finances, and really the earlier the better. And this is just one example. So the cost of financial advice. So there's definitely a role for financial advisors, and this a little beyond the scope of this talk, but I link one of these discussions that talks about financial advisors and kind of helpful in seeing whether you think you're in a situation where you might need one. But if you pay just 2% of your portfolio each year in fees, commissions, and expenses, it's kind of surprising how much over the course of your career you might end up with. So for 30-year career, an 8% pre-fee return, if you're saving $50,000 a year, at the end of that your career, the difference in the pay that you're going to be taking home is $6.1 million versus $4.2 million. And it brings in the question, is the advisor really worth $2 million to you? That's a long period of time, and it gets at there is a role for financial advisors, but a lot of it is to give you advice and to teach you, and maybe not do it for you for long term. But in general, if you are in a situation where you think you need a financial advisor, especially early on, a fair price is probably going to be in the 4-figure range per year. And if you're thinking it's going to be more than that, you might want to stay away. So for getting acquainted with personal finance, there's 4 books that the White Coat Investor recommends that I think are all very reasonable and good books to get started with. And so it's kind of an initial first investment of your time to kind of get through these books, probably during training if possible, but sometime early in the career it's helpful. The Personal Finance for Dummies, The Bobblehead's Guide to Investing, How to Think About Money, The White Coat Investor, the original book. And then if you're really looking for the efficient way to do this, and this is just my opinion here, as most of this is the Financial Bootcamp book, which came out more recently. I think is very concise and takes chapter by chapter important issues. If you're looking for a very efficient way to get through this, I think that's a good option. And there's a free option, which is this William Bernstein 16-page PDF, which is also very good. And the end result of doing all this is to put a written financial plan in place, so you really have a plan for what your finances will be over the next 5, 10, and plus years. And the general recommendation is to read 1 good financial book a year, and to follow a good financial blog, reading 5 to 10 posts per month. I think, to me, if you can get 1 in a week and just have it kind of like almost like the quad shot for finance, but just once a week is pretty helpful, just to continue to learn as you go. So transitioning to disability insurance, why start here? And to explain why disability insurance is a good starting point for getting into the different topics, I need to define a couple terms. So financial independence can be defined as the accumulation of sufficient wealth to prevent life without dependency on employment income while maintaining desired quality of life, meaning that you can work, but you don't have to maintain your current quality of life. And then there's the concept of net worth, which is your assets minus liabilities. And for us coming out of training or in training, a lot of us have liabilities in the form of student loans. So our net worth is significantly in the negative for a lot of us. And high income does not equal high net worth. And so for us, early career radiation oncologists and trainees, it's really a high potential income for a lot of us, is that we may not be at that kind of attending salary quite yet. And our net worth is likely not just low, but probably negative for most of us based on some of the surveys for radiation oncology and medical students overall. So your greatest asset is the ability to have the potential for high income. And so over a average physician income, this may be higher for radiation oncology, especially depending on what region you're in of the country, of $275,000, hoping everyone has at least a 30-year career. That's over $8 million in total income. And physicians do become disabled. 12 to 18% of Americans currently are disabled. 1/3 of these will have disability at least 90 days. 1/8 will have it for more than 5 years. 90% of these are caused by illness. And doctors, there's higher rates of mental disabilities and musculoskeletal problems leading to disability for doctors overall. Noting that I think radiation oncology is probably lower risk to some specialties. It's a preferred specialty for disability insurance compared to others like surgeons, but it's still could be a catastrophic event. The long-term disability insurance pays a monthly benefit that's tax-free as long as you're paying it out of your own pocket. Become disabled for greater than 90 days. And then generally it'll continue to around the age of retirement, or 65 years, somewhere around there. There are programs that are paid for by your employer, and those are not tax-free in general, but for most cases for individual plans, you're going to be getting that money out without taxes on it. And then in general, these companies are probably going to want to insure as much as you want, more or less, but it's going to be 60 to 70% of your income. In general, no one's going to want you to be more valuable disabled than you are working. The only exception maybe as a resident. Generally, you can get about $5,000 a month in coverage. So the tip would be to buy it as soon as possible. The younger, the cheaper it is. To do it, you need your most recent W-2. You need kind of current spending, plus we anticipate for retirement savings. Because again, policy is only going to pay monthly up until the age of 65 or 67, and hopefully we're all living longer than that. In the individual policies that you get, there's pros and cons, but there's stronger definition of disability. So things you want to look for are terms like specialty specific or own occupation, and there's weaker definitions of like modified own occupation, or perhaps the weakest, any occupation, meaning that if you could work any job, then you may not get benefits from that. The individual policies that you're looking for tend to be specialty specific for own occupation, specific to radiation oncology. And it's important to understand how your policy fits with other disability policies and programs that you may be eligible for. And for that, an independent agent can be helpful for advice on that. And there's lots of topics on this online on various websites. And again, I already noted my bias of the White Investor website has good topics on this. The group policies tend to be a weaker definition of especially specific. They're often non-portable, meaning that if you change jobs, they don't go with you in general. And one of the downsides of that is, let's say you have an incredible disability insurance through a group or a job that you have now, or that you're going to take. If you choose to leave that job at some point, that disability insurance may not follow you. And one of the problems with that is, depending on when you're leaving, you may be older, your premiums may be more expensive at that point. And then there's obviously always a risk that something would happen to your health that would make you uninsurable or increase your rates even further. So again, it's just mitigating risk. Oftentimes the individual policies at a younger age when you're in training or soon after that, to me, I'm just risk averse, and it tends to make you feel better. And then for the group policies, tend to be fewer questions about your health or no exam at all, For the individual policies, they're going to generally require, physical or recent, basic labs that they'll either get through your primary or order on their own and come get them. The riders are an important part of disability insurance. And so riders are basically just additions to the policy. So you basically have a premium that you're going to get, and you can elect to add riders or additions to your policy. And all these are kind of elective that you can choose. And there's a whole bunch of them. And you have to pay for each one of them. There's a certain amount you're going to have to end up paying. So the ones that I found useful that I ended up getting when I was a resident was this residual and partial disability. And if you read about this, generally it's considered to be a must-have type thing, that if you're able to work some, that you're going to be covered. Another one is the cost of living adjustment. So this tends to be something that's recommended in general for the first half of your career. So this cost of living adjustment rider is, once the policy starts paying, then the amount that you receive per month will increase with inflation, usually up to a max of about 3 to 6% per year. And so if you're unfortunate enough to get disabled early in your career, that's going to be important, because the inflation over several decades, hopefully, the length of your, till you get to 65, could be significant, and that you're going to be essentially receiving less and less money per month effectively if it's not compensated for inflation. So that's the benefit of having that rider. And again, the riders you have to pay a little bit extra for, depending on what it is. Now, the future purchase option is basically another rider where you can increase your insurance at a later date without additional health questions or exams. So it kind of guarantees that you can buy the policy at the current price for your age at the time you choose to exercise the rider. And for me personally, and for a lot of people, this rider you use when you transition from residency to attending life. In that, as a resident, you're probably, like I was saying, probably for most residents, the most you're going to be able to get per month is $5,000 a month, which may not be as much as you would like. And then once you're attending, you can potentially increase that up to 67% of your income. So it can go up quite a lot. So you can use this rider to avoid having to do another health question or exam at the time of increasing that. And again, it mitigates risk, because you're not at risk of having something happen in that meantime, or maybe you're not going to be insurable to increase it, and you won't be stuck at that lower level. So that's the advantage of getting a future purchase rider or option rider. Once you get to kind of an amount where you think it's going to fit your quality of life, you can get rid of this rider, because it does add significant expense to it that you're going to be paying to have this option. So once you exercise it, you can drop it from your policy. So that's one thing to consider. And again, there's going to be independent agents that you can get to help you with the disability insurance that are very helpful. There's other riders out there that are commonly talked about, like catastrophic disability or retirement riders. And there's some good advice online about it, but generally you're probably not going to get those. You're probably just going to get a policy that fits your quality of life that you desire for a monthly amount, and just stick with that. It's expensive. So it's about 6% of the monthly benefit. So for a $10,000 benefit, which you may end up getting more than that possibly, it's going to be $200 to $600 per month. And it's important to understand how your individual policy, which again tends to be more expensive, more specialty specific, portable with you between jobs, coincides with your group policy, wherever your job may be, or wherever you're going to take a job. There's independent agents that can be helpful for this. You can find them pretty easily online. I went through the White Coat Investor website. I've already explained my bias. I have no financial connection to them. I've just found it to be helpful. So that's what I did. And then you can ask for discounts. There's all sorts of ways to get money off. There's resident discounts. There's preferred specialty discounts, which thankfully in major college we fall into. There's also options where You can limit your coverage to the 24 months for substance-related or mental health disability during your lifetime, and that'll get you another discount depending if that's a risk you're willing to take. Generally, for men, you're looking for a sex-specific policy, and for women, it's cheaper to do a unisex policy for disability insurance in general. And then, like I was talking about with the future purchase rider or other riders, you can cancel them as you go if you find them to be not needed in the future. And that's the main one that I thought of that I ended up canceling. And then when you become financially independent, which may be a while, but that's again, when you don't need to rely on your salary or your compensation from work to live in the lifestyle you'd like, then you can cancel the policy altogether because you're kind of self-insuring yourself at that point because you have the finances to support it. And you may be working because you want to, but not because you need to. Now, a lot of these policies, there's some flexibility here, but in general, they're going to have a 90-day waiting period. So this brings up a concept of an emergency fund. Do you need some amount of money to get you through a tough time? And that could be disability, or it could be anything. It could be a health expense, it could be a car accident, if you're a homeowner, home, that type of thing. It's hard to do. I found it hard to do as a resident, but we were able to save up a bit for a few months of expenses if we needed. And what I found talking to other friends that recently graduated in past years is that having a small emergency fund, even as a resident, can give you a little bit more flexibility, particularly in the transition from residency to a job. Because let's say you have a job that doesn't start till, they don't need someone till November or October. And if you didn't have like some way of supporting yourself in that meantime, you may have to take out a loan, or it may be difficult to take a job like that where it may be more desirable but for you for other reasons, but you have to wait a period of time. And so having a small emergency fund is helpful for 1 to 3 months of expense, or just $1,000, something small can be helpful too. Because it doesn't come free, because obviously you're having other investments or other loans that you're not paying off, you're saving that money. And so for me, what I did was I put it in a high yield savings fund. There's different banks that have those. I personally used Ally, which is like an online ALY online account. It's a high yield savings account, but they call it high yield, but it's like a 1% kind of what you get back. So it's not huge, but it helped at least me feel better about having some money if needed for an emergency. And then as you grow as an attending, this is what I'm planning to do. This is what I think is generally recommended if you can, is to have like kind of 3 months, certainly to get to that disability, that 90-day waiting period, but even longer is helpful as you pay off other stuff. There's no reason not to. Transitioning to life insurance. Not everyone necessarily needs life insurance, but if anyone depends on your income, then you need it. And one thing to consider is that even if the exception to that in my mind is that if you have a stay-at-home parent, you could consider covering them. And there's pros and cons. It's an extra expense, maybe you don't need it. But I know for me personally, we did it because we felt like if something happened to my spouse who stay at home, then especially early on in my career, it might be challenging to coordinate that. And having a $250,000 to $500,000 policy, even something small, relatively small, to get you through that time could be helpful. So that's just depends on your risk. Again, I said I was risk averse. That's my other bias. So the term life insurance is what you generally want. It's basically black or white. If you die, it pays. It's compared to disability insurance, it's very inexpensive. And then women, as opposed to disability insurance, life insurance for women tends to be cheaper. And so, because it's cheap, a lot of people get these long-term, like 20 or 30-year term life insurance policies. And it's not going to be very much for someone in early career or in residency. Whole life insurance, it tends to not be worth it, and it tends to be worth avoiding. it'll get pitched to you, but it's more expensive, and there's like an investment part to it, and generally just is not worth it. So sticking to the basics for me, term life insurance is generally what we'd all want. And to estimate how much you might need is your monthly expenses, times 12 months times 25 years. That's a kind of a common calculation. If you have remaining mortgage, estimated college costs, if you have kids or any private loans that may not be forgiven when you die, noting that federal student loans will be forgiven. And then you want to subtract any current savings if you have any. And then showing how cheap it is, if you round up to the nearest million as in general advice, it's not going to be that much more. And so for most doctors, that's going to be 2 to 5 million. And this may be something that you may need this much as a resident if you have a family perhaps. And it's possible to get. It can be a little harder just budgeting, especially if you're in an expensive city, to do that. But it's something you can always increase and get as soon as you transition to an attending life. So you get 500 to $1 million perhaps as a resident if you're not able to afford a higher policy, and then get that 3 to 4 million or whatever that calculation comes out for you personally once you're an attending. And it tends to not be a huge burden in terms of the cost. Once you're out, this is general recommendations for the insurance that you'll need. As a resident, don't have to worry about health insurance too much. For most places, it's going to be pretty cheap and pretty inclusive. Disability insurance we went over. Jumping down to term life insurance we went over. For homeowners or renters insurance, to me, again, seeing the basics, I think one thing to consider when you transition, or even before, but for me it happened when I graduated, was I really looked at the renter's insurance to make sure I was covered enough, and ended up thinking in hindsight that I probably was exposing myself a little bit and not having enough coverage. And so that's something to really look at and what you need. Now, malpractice for a lot of places is going to be grouped in with where you're working. You can consider this umbrella coverage of personal liability. Again, I'm not a lawyer. I saw Austin on here. Austin's a lawyer, so maybe he knows. But in general, my perspective on this from reading some on it is that I'm not planning to get it right now, but as soon as my assets start to accumulate a bit, then I probably will. It's very cheap. It's something I'm kind of considering now, but haven't gotten. So I don't know if anyone has any comments on that. Feel free. Be curious to see what other people have to think about that one. So transitioning to student loan management. I think we all know this. This is it's a big problem, and this is something that the medical schools in general at least have some teaching about. I know I personally didn't get teaching on the different life insurance and disability insurance and retirement funds, but this was something that at least was discussed with us. So it's high, at least 200,000 for MDs is very common. It's just getting worse for a lot of people. The rates have gone up over the last 20 years, and now we're in 6 to 7% for the loans that a lot of people have. And it's a really big deal, because if you have $400,000 in debt, 75% or 7.5% interest, you're paying $4,900 per month for 10 years. So even if a rate of oncology salary is maybe a bit more than that, it's still a huge amount of your income. Let's say 30% of what you're taking home, or 25, just going toward loans over 10 years. So it's a big problem. So everyone needs a specific plan that works for them. And again, I think most people know more about this than the other things. At least that's how I was before I started really kind of reading. And so all these acronyms, alphabet soup. So hopefully everyone kind of knows about these. I think in general, these are this is from 2016. This is how much your payments would be, if you fall within this category, is income-based repayments. So in general, I think in training, most people are in a revised pay-as-you-earn program. In general, that's probably going to be the best for 90% of people in radiation oncology trainees. There are exceptions, but in general, that's the case. So the payment is 10% of discretionary income without a maximum. There's taxable forgiveness after 25 years, which again is you're probably not going to be paying them that far out, hopefully. Payments do count toward the public loan forgiveness, which we'll talk about. And probably the main advantage to the revised pay-as-you-earn is that part of the interest is subsidized during your residency, so that by the government. So that's what helps and makes it a little bit better for most people. I think the main decision, as we all know, is public service loan forgiveness. You have to make 120 payments, so basically 10 years of monthly payments in this program. You have to do the certification or verification once a year, and it's really easy to fall behind on that. So if you're early in your training, for instance, like make sure you get it from your intern year, because I've heard of places having a lot of turnover and ends up being just an unnecessary hassle to get these things signed off to say that you worked there for that year and made those payments that qualified. In addition, I'm sure a lot of people have had this experience, is that the loan servicers, I don't want to name names, but sometimes they're hard to get a hold of, and there's going to be some transitions in that in the future on the companies that do that, or the company that does that. And so it's really important to document everything, to keep records for yourself, to be able to verify on your own and not rely on any other company that you're making these payments on time. And again, I think as a lot of us know that have these student loans now, is that because of COVID, there's a 0% interest on these for now, I think up until October, and then we'll see what happens. And this should count toward your payments. And as all of us know, you just don't want to be in forbearance. You want to be making at least low payments during your training, with the idea that you might have public loan forgiveness in the end. And most academic jobs fall into this. Not all of them, but a lot of them do. And again, this is basically, you're trying to pay as low as possible amount as you can and get the maximum forgiven after 10 years. So, you should have zero. For most people, it's going to be $0 payments your first year of residency, because they're going off, if you file a tax return or you're able to justify that based on $0 of income as a fourth-year med student for most people. That's going to be what you're paying. And then for the first year out, arguably, you'd be going after your resident salary or half resident and then attending salary. So it's going to be less. So it is a good option, and it works for a lot of people if you can find the right job that fits this. And with Raise Oncology being 5 years long, for most people, you're either going to be 5 or 4.5 years along in this process. So it could save you a lot of money, and it's worth trying to figure out if it fits for you. Here's some information. Basically, the public service loan forgiveness program, could at any time go away. I would think it would be surprising. I've tried to read on this. A lot of people don't think that would happen, especially people already in the program. But there's a lot of unfair things in life, and so if you're trying to really mitigate risk, you could consider having a separate fund as kind of a backup in case the public loan forgiveness goes away or something happens to it, or it's limited and capped at the amount of forgiven. I think it's unlikely, but something to consider. And I just put a link there that does discuss, options for that side fund and recommendations. The other option is student loan refinancing. And so this basically goes to a private company to lower your rate from 6 to 7%, for instance, for a federal student loan, to the lowest to be a variable 5-year rate, probably in the 2 to 4% range. Although these things are highly variable. You must qualify. Not all doctors are going to get the same rate, and you may not be offered the same terms. It's dependent on debt levels, income levels, and credit. So maybe something that early in your career, the rate isn't that good, but it's better. And then a year down the road, it may be better for you. You may be able to get a better rate. And so you can refinance more than once. You can refinance as much as you like, more or less. And it's worth reading about to see the ramifications of that. But generally, they're going to be positive to refinance to a lower interest rate. It is possible to do it during residency. I can say I personally did not, because I was strongly considering going a more academic route. In the end, it ended up where I don't qualify for it, so now I'm refinancing. Yeah, and again, this is just reiterating what I said. The revised pay-as-you-earn plan may be better for federal loans while you're in training, because your interest rate you may get with refinancing it may be a little better, but it may not be worth it to you, because the biggest thing is once you refinance, public service loan forgiveness is out. You can't go back. Once you can get those loans and refinance into a private investor, they're going to stick with you. And so there's no getting rid of them at that point. So if you get a surprise in your career in what job you take out of residency, then refinancing could hurt you. But if you feel very strongly that maybe you won't end up at one of those non-for-profit or VA or military government jobs, then you could do it and save some interest. For attendings, basically, you got to refinance all your private loans, get as low as interest rate as possible. Again, the best terms tend to be the 5-year variable loans, and refinance every time you can to get a lower rate is general advice. Yeah, I don't think that's too controversial to say that. And then other questions are similar to the ones we went over, and hopefully by the time you get to that point, you've kind of figured this out for yourself, and you're not out a couple years before you're deciding what to do. It should be, hopefully it's something that you're figuring out during residency on what your plan is, or as soon as you figure out what job you have after residency. So if you're working for a full-time 501c government employer, if you made a lot of payments, small payments during residency, figure out how many you've given, and then in general, public loan forgiveness is probably a good option for you. The exception, which is very uncommon, I would think, in radiation oncology or in most fields of medicine, is that if you have debt that's more than 2.5 times your gross income, you probably want to get some professional advice about what to do. But these forgiveness programs that aren't public loan forgiveness, they aren't the 120 payments, but they're longer, it may work out in your favor, but that's a pretty complex issue. And it gets very complex if you have a spouse that has loans, and that's kind of beyond the scope of this talk. And it's not rocket science on how to pay them off. You just gotta send huge checks every month to the lender. Easiest to do right out of residency for lifestyle inflation. Live like a resident is just a mantra that we all have to live by for at least 2 to 5 years after residency or until those loans are paid off. Maybe it's different for those MD PhD folks among us. Maybe it's different for them, but they, you guys invested your time elsewhere. But it's living like a resident is always a good mantra for the first few years. And here's just an example. So the average resident salary is $60,000. Jump up to an average attending salary, which is $275,000, or maybe even more than that. Taxes coming out about $75,000. If you keep the same living expenses, then that leaves $140,000 to do with pay off loans, save for down payment on your house, max out the retirement accounts, take advantage of any matching that your job offers for retirement accounts, because that's really, at the end of the day, part of your salary. If you don't take advantage of that, you're leaving part of the salary on the table. And then if you really did this and just dedicate it to loans, you could pay off a huge amount of loans in a short period of time by living like a resident, even just for a couple of years. So even if you had $400,000 in loans, you can be done with this in 3 years. And then you can transition to whatever lifestyle you wish, but you'll be free of those loans, which would feel really good. So transitioning to basic retirement accounts now. They're great, basically. There's asset protection. Most creditors can't, most states you can't go after these type of accounts. Estate planning, they're easy to designate beneficiaries on these. It's really, you can just set it up from the very beginning in a couple of minutes. If you need to rebalance your portfolios, you don't get taxed on selling as assets. And then it supports your behavior, because in general, you can't get them out these. I mean, there's a lot of exceptions to this, but usually the 59.5 rule, until you're that age, you can't get it out without some penalty unless something happens in your life, that type of thing. There's definitely workarounds on that. But that kind of the complexity of that for most people, including myself, tends to help people pay themselves. And there's just huge tax savings for doing it. And the basics of this is that there's really just 2 types of accounts in general, like big strokes, the basics. There's tax deferred accounts, and there's a tax-free account, which is also called a Roth. And so basically the Roth would be something that you pay taxes on on the money now. It's kind of post-tax, and then you put it in an account. But when you pull it out, so let's say in retirement, you do not get taxed on it all at that point. So for residents, that makes pretty good sense to do it that way. So for the tax code for 2020, depending on your income, you're going to get taxed a certain rate here, and this rate you can effectively lower by having retirement accounts. So your marginal tax rate is basically the tax bracket you're in, but your effective tax rate could be something much lower, and that's what you're generally trying to do. You're trying to minimize the amount of taxes that you pay, and so this is the Roth IRA is a good option for doing that, because likely when you're in residency, you're going to be in the lowest tax bracket that you may ever be in again in your life, and so you're going to pay a lower tax on that initial investment there. But then when you put it in your Roth account, you'll never pay tax on it again. So when you're having a higher income salary later on, or even in retirement, you may be in a higher tax bracket, depending on how much money you're taking out in a given year. It's going to end up saving you money. Now, part of it hurts because you're paying taxes on it now, where you could put it into a tax deferred account and not pay taxes on it now. But in the long run, you can't really argue with the math that in the long run, for a resident, on a resident salary, for most people, a Roth investment like a Roth IRA is probably the way to go. Now, with that said, if you can get an employer match, even as a resident, then it's probably worth looking into, and it's probably, for most people, going to be worth it. And after residency, it almost definitely is going to be worth it. There's something called a plan document for retirement accounts that you should get through your employer. They're all going to have these available. The plan document is just basically a summary of what their investments are. And there's, if you Google this, there's a website that can be helpful for evaluating it. And this is, again, a white coat investor bias, but Morningstar.com is a way to evaluate these mutual funds. And so after you've kind of read about mutual funds and that type of thing, it's worth looking into with the plan document to make sure it's reasonable. And I want to plug someone else, my mentor, Dr. Yachieli. He's going to have, it hasn't been announced officially, and it's going to be through Arrow, I believe he said, is he's going to have a talk that focuses on retirement accounts. And so for time's sake, I'm not going to go over detailed for what would be the 403B, 457B, 401Ks, profit sharing, all that stuff. That's important for early career radiation oncologists, including myself right now. But for that talk, I think he said it'd probably be in August or September. So be on the lookout for that. And I think he's been always very helpful for me. He knows a lot about it. Been out of residency for probably about 6 years now. So he's gone through these things. And I think that'll be a really nice talk to look out for, to figure out these type things like backdoor Roth IRAs, Roth IRAs, the health savings accounts, those type of things, which are super important, especially when you're out of residency. Finally, for index funds, if you open a Roth IRA, for example, as a resident, you have to choose where you're going to put your funds. And to me, it doesn't have, I'm a simple person when it comes to this stuff. And so you can keep it very simple. There's some very simple guidance on what to do. And I think, for time's sake, I'll skip over some of this, but the reality is that no one has a crystal ball. No one knows exactly what's going to happen with the markets. And there's lots of promises out there that, you can beat the market or time the market. And that may be true for some people, but a lot of times for active investment accounts, the cost of doing it is going to negate any benefits that you would get, and likely you would not get any benefits from doing that. So these kind of investments of just index funds, mutual funds, tend to be a pretty good way to go in general. And then especially for someone, I think for me, personally, again, I do this because I feel a responsibility to learn about it, but it's not like I'm not an expert in these different funds. And so it keeps it simple, and you can have a low cost mutual fund that is going to perform more or less as good as the market and as good as other funds. And that's going to serve you quite well in the long run. And these are just some, people that have spent their careers in this. That low cost index fund is the most simple equity investment for the great majority of investors, which I would include myself in that. So that's the message there. is that once you open one of those accounts, you kind of have to choose. And these plans can do broadly diversified between asset classes like stocks and bonds. And in general, the advice is going to be to you can put more risk on early on in your career because you have a lot more time to make it up. So you may have a portfolio that's 75 to 80% stocks and the rest bonds, for example, or something like that. And there's a lot of options here, but it can be very simple in just a couple of index funds you invest in. Or there's even, if you want to keep it super simple, there's these target date funds that you just put in your retirement. You may pay a slightly bit more, but still, like through Vanguard, it's still, for example, it's still very cheap to have one of these target retirement funds. And there's pros and cons to it, but the thing you can't argue with it is it keeps it very simple, and it's gonna follow the market pretty well. So hopefully in the long run, historically, that would benefit you. Hopefully that will continue to benefit us, that the market will go up over the next 30 years. Finally, getting to a written financial plan is something important for residents and attendings alike. And I always like these. They always remind me of up to date, these little waterfall plots, like basically you put money into disability insurance, and extra gets filled over to life insurance, and you have a tiny emergency fund, and then you refinance these things. There's a whole lot of literature on this topic. These, again, my bias is from the White Coat Investor. If you Google like financial plans, I always find it helpful because they're pretty short and they summarize things very well. But basically you have a list of priorities that you're going to pay off as you have extra income. And it's going to change when you're a resident versus attending. That may change on what you can do with these. And then it also changes with your work. You have different matching for your retirement funds, and that may change what you prioritize. And again, I want to plug Dr. Haley's talk on that retirement fund side. I think that'll be helpful for all of us. And at the end of the day, all these topics that we talk about, they all have their own rabbit holes. They all can go into great detail. But the take home is live like a resident. That's the key. Your savings rate is key. It's much easier to live like resident training in the first few times out than to go back to inflate your lifestyle with a fancy car or a big, sorry, it's jumping around on me, a big house, and then have to pull back from that. And so I agree with this, the first year of attending is the most important of financial life because it really sets the tone for your career. Paying off those loans, either refinancing or setting up for public loan forgiveness. All that stuff can be set up then. And if you don't do it then, you're kind of playing catch up later on. In the long run, that can hurt you. Finally, with limited time, we're going to go to contract evaluation. So this is just general advice. A lot of people change jobs. We've all heard this in the first few years after training, and there's a lot of reasons you would change jobs. I think in general, this is good advice that you shouldn't buy a house unless you're in a stable personal and professional situation. You may choose to rent for the first year until the job feels good, or if it's a partnership track and it's a couple years, you may choose to rent until that decision's been made on whether you're going to be there long term. For negotiations with contracts, this is a whole other thing in its own, could be definitely its own talk. But one thing that I found helpful is that this NGMA data kind of gives you an idea of what, race ecology, there's different things out there, what a specialist gets paid in a certain region in private versus academic, what are the certain percentiles of 25th or 50th or 75th percentile for these things. And it's a nice way to kind of, you're not saying, oh, this isn't enough, but just say like, hey, this is what the data shows. And it provides a nice database. We're a database field, data-driven field, and so are the people in general making decisions, hiring. So I think it's a nice way to negotiate for that salary. Keep in mind that salary is not the end-all be-all. There are other, even just financial considerations, such as the matching for retirement would be a big thing otherwise. And then even beyond the finances of things, there's so many other factors that are unique to each of us and that we want in our career. And that may be time for research, that may be funding support, that may be autonomy to make the best decisions we want. And it may be to do as much brachytherapy as possible because we love doing brachytherapy. And even though it doesn't reimburse as well, if you handle your personal finances, maybe you can do more brachytherapy. So all these things factor in, obviously, and each of us is different. But really prioritizing what you want out of a contract, out of a job, is really important going in. And then, I guess offline, I'd be happy to talk about my experience with my limited experience with contracts, just going through it once, if anyone is interested. And then other things to ask on the contract: how is your paycheck determined? What happens if you leave? Non-complete clauses are huge, and so you may find a job in an area that you really like, which is great, but they may have a big non-compete that's very difficult to get around, and you're going to need expert help to figure out how enforceable it is and all that stuff. Finding a lawyer that specializes in this type of thing in the state you're looking for is critical, and that's super helpful. It can be feel a little bit expensive. Sorry, one second. But it's worth it in the long run to do it, especially if it's a couple jobs that you're really trying to decide between. Having expert in physician contracts in the state is super helpful. So what did we learn today? We all have a second job, and it sounds daunting. I found that daunting to hear we had a second job talking about finances, but I think an initial investment, if you can do it, read those books and just get in the habit of reading every once in a while, even just once a week, reading a little blog post from a reliable source. It goes a long way in helping us learn about these things. Unless you do treat it like a second job, none of us become experts in these things, but even a brief investment of time in these things will help us in the long run live more, in my opinion, more fulfilling careers and even lives, and help those around us, and help take better care of patients in the long run too. Buy disability insurance. There was a reason it was like one of the first things we talked about. That's something catastrophic that can happen to any of us at a young age. If someone relies on your income, then you should consider buying term life insurance, and in general, avoid something called whole life insurance. If you can, try to save a small emergency fund. It can be very small, but it helps even if you're sacrificing paying off a little bit in loans. To me, it's a little more peace of mind. And again, for me, there's other safe ways to do it that'll get some investment return. And for me personally, I just chose like a high yield savings account to have that fund available if needed. A way to get in the habit of saving is to use the Roth accounts as residents. So if you don't have matching at your institution, at your residency, which I did not, the Roth IRA seems to be a really good way to go. It's after tax, but it's gonna, in the long run, the math works out where you're gonna be saving money doing that. And it's gonna compound interest over time. The earlier you put this money in, the better. And hopefully it'll benefit you 30, 35 years down the road. Living like a resident is probably the best advice anyone's ever told me. And so just paying that forward. Much easier to continue on that path, 2 to 5 years, get all the loans paid off, and then you can do whatever you want with that money. It may be increasing your lifestyle, it may be increasing your charity, all those things, whatever you want to do. It may just open up new doors for you where you're less dependent on worrying about RVUs or things like that. So I think in a lot of intangible ways, it'll help all of us live happier lives. And then going to your job with eyes wide open, knowing that people do switch jobs. Not a lot of people stay with their first job, but I think knowing that hopefully a lot of people on this call are within the first few years out of residency or still in residency. One of the things I love about radiation oncology is that it's a small field and we get to know so many of us. And to me, it sounds cliche, but I feel like we're kind of in this together. I feel like I applied to jobs with like a group of like 10 people I was really close to, and we could compare how things were going. And that's hugely helpful. And I hope that continues, studying for these boards that we'll have one day and in our careers. And so please reach out if I can ever be of help to anyone, or if anyone has any comments or questions about today's talk, can do that now. I know it's at 1 o'clock, or feel free to do it offline, Twitter, email, phone calls, whatever's easiest. So thank you all for your attention today. I really appreciate it in the middle of the day, and hopefully talk to some of you soon. Does anybody have any questions right now or comments?
My comment was that was an amazing talk. This is Zaki.
Oh, hey, Zaki. Hey.
Really good job. Really enjoyed
Thanks, man.
Hey, thanks for
Another
the shout out,
critical thing
David.
is
It's
to find a
awesome.
free person to watch your cat during residency, and Zaki was mine, at least intern year. I really struggled to replace him.
Hey, thanks for the shout out, David. It's awesome. Again, I'd like to echo, it's a great talk. While I do have a law degree, I'm not licensed to practice law, so I can't give legal advice. So I would like to echo the real importance of having an attorney review your contract before you sign. You know, a lot of these non-competes may or may not even be enforceable, and so that's important to know beforehand, so you kind of know what you're getting yourself into. And then the note about umbrella insurance, I think is also a great point. I think, you know, by virtue of being a physician that, you know, can put a target on your back, you know, for litigation, you know, if anything were to happen, and something like that would be useful to protect your assets.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Austin. All right, I think that might be it. But thanks again for everyone for joining, and feel free to reach out anytime. Like I said, I'm going through this process, and we'll continue to go through this process in the future, and we're happy to talk to anyone about this. So thanks a lot.
Hey, David, can you hear me? This is Mike.
Yeah. Hey, Mike.
Hey, this is Mike Bernstein. Thank you so much. I'm the new practitioner chair for ACRO that works alongside Jessica. And just wanted to thank you so much for your time. I thought that was supremely helpful. I agree that we haven't really had formal training. I'm about 5 years out from residency training, and I found all of your topic points and talking points really extremely helpful, from everything from investments to retirement to disability, and all of it, even at this stage in the career, is really, really useful. I wish I would have known some of it earlier on, but even being a new practitioner, I thought it was really, really helpful in all of your resources. And thanks for being available for people to reach out to you, even post the talk. I know I got a lot of emails from my colleagues at Sloan Kettering that might not have been able to join, but we're asking if it's going to be recorded and if it's going to be available for them to look at a later date. So I'm sure, yeah, you might have a lot of people contacting you even subsequent to talk. So just wanted to thank you very much. And a quick plug for everyone that might still be here on the talk is, you know, we do these amazing webinars every single month, David's included. So thanks everyone for taking the time to listen into these webinars. We try to pick topics that are maybe a little outside the box from your traditional breast cancer, lung cancer talks, like personal finances and some things about social media. Next month, the date to be determined, we're going to have someone talking about financial toxicity for cancer patients. So just keep your eye out for these ACRO emails about webinars. And if there's anything I can answer about webinars or ACRO in general for new practitioner residents, you could please reach out to me. Please go to the ACRO website. You'll see a lot of good resources there for maintenance of certification and CME, mentorship programs. We're probably going to do the annual meeting virtually, but there are going to be a lot of interesting and exciting plenary sessions. So ACRO is just a really great resource for residents and new practitioners, and for topics such as this on personal finances that you may not get with other committees and national organizations. So thanks everyone for joining and participating. And again, special thanks to David for all of your time and expertise on the topic.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot, Mike. All right, take care, everyone.